Steve Jobs didn't just build successful companies. He revolutionized 6 industries: personal computing, animated movies, music, phones, tablet computing, and digital publishing. He created products that billions of people use daily and changed how we interact with technology. But perhaps more fascinating than what he built is how he built it, and what drove one of the most complex, difficult, and visionary leaders in business history. Today, we're diving into Walter Isaacson's definitive biography, Steve Jobs, based on over 40 interviews with Jobs himself, plus hundreds of interviews with family, friends, colleagues, and competitors. Jobs chose Isaacson to write his biography and cooperated fully with one condition. He wouldn't have control over the content. The result is an unflinching portrait that shows both genius and darkness, vision and cruelty, the triumph and the cost. What makes this biography extraordinary is its honesty. Isaacson doesn't sanitize Jobs into a hero or reduce him to a villain. He shows us a complete human being, someone capable of creating world-changing products and inspiring fierce loyalty, but also capable of denying paternity of his daughter, parking in handicapped spaces, and reducing colleagues to tears with brutal criticism. Understanding both sides is essential to understanding Jobs' success and legacy. Jobs wasn't a programmer, engineer, or designer in the traditional sense. His genius was integration, combining technology with liberal arts, hardware with software, design with functionality. He understood that great products require obsessive attention to every detail, even the ones users never see. And he had the reality distortion field, the ability to convince people that impossible things were achievable, then push them until they achieved those impossible things. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll explore Jobs' complete story, his unconventional upbringing and early influences, the founding and loss of Apple, his wilderness years at Next and Pixar, his triumphant return and transformation of Apple, his product philosophy and leadership principles, his personal life and relationships, and the lessons we can extract from his extraordinary but complicated life. If you've ever wondered what actually drove Steve Jobs, how he thought about products and innovation, what made him both inspiring and insufferable, or what lessons we can learn from someone who changed the world despite, or perhaps because of, his flaws, this is your guide. Let's discover the real Steve Jobs. Chapter 1. Early Life and the Founding of Apple. Steve Jobs was born in 1955 and adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, working-class parents who saved to send him to college. Isaacson reveals that Jobs' adoption shaped his psychology profoundly. He felt both special, chosen, and abandoned, given up. This duality drove much of his behavior, the need to prove his worth, and the difficulty forming intimate relationships. Jobs grew up in Silicon Valley during its transformation from orchards to the technology capital of the world. His father, a mechanic, taught him that craftsmanship mattered even in hidden places, a lesson Jobs carried throughout his career. When Paul Jobs built a fence, he finished the back as carefully as the front, because you have to know it's beautiful all the way around. In high school, Jobs met Steve Wozniak, a brilliant engineer 5 years older, who became his partner in mischief and eventually business. Their first collaboration was building and selling blue boxes, illegal devices that hacked phone systems to make free calls. Jobs learned a crucial lesson. You could build something technically impressive, and people would pay for it. Jobs attended Reed College for one semester before dropping out, but continued auditing classes for another 18 months, including a calligraphy course that later influenced the Mac's typography. He experimented with LSD, traveled to India seeking enlightenment, and adopted an extreme diet that he believed eliminated body odor, allowing him to skip showers. Colleagues confirmed he was mistaken. In 1976, Wozniak designed a personal computer for hobbyists. Jobs immediately saw broader potential. He convinced Wozniak they should start a company, found funding, and named it Apple Computer. Jobs was 21. Wozniak was the technical genius, but Jobs provided vision, ambition, and the critical understanding that packaging and presentation mattered as much as technology. The Apple. I was a modest success, but the Apple II, launched in 1977, became one of the first mass-market personal computers. Jobs insisted on a sleek case. Computers then were sold as circuit boards to be housed in whatever you wanted. He understood that design wasn't just aesthetics, it was how things worked. The Apple II's success made Jobs a millionaire by age 25. But success came with conflict. Jobs was already demonstrating the difficult personality that would mark his entire career. He could be inspirational one moment and cruel the next. He denied stock options to early employees while granting them generously to later hires. He parked in handicapped spaces and regularly reduced people to tears. Yet those same people often said working with him was the best experience of their careers. In 1979, Jobs visited Xerox PARC and saw the future. Computers with graphical user interfaces operated by a mouse, with overlapping windows and icons. Xerox had invented these technologies but didn't understand their potential. Jobs immediately grasped that this was how all computers should work. He set Apple to work building a computer with these features: the Macintosh. The Mac launched in 1984 with a famous Super Bowl commercial and enormous hype. It was revolutionary, the first mass-market computer with a graphical interface. But it was also slow, had too little memory, and Jobs had refused to include expansion slots or a fan, prioritizing design over functionality. Sales disappointed. Meanwhile, Jobs's management style created chaos. He divided the company into warring camps, played favorites, and humiliated people publicly. In 1985, after a power struggle with CEO John Sculley, whom Jobs had recruited, the Apple board sided with Sculley. Jobs was stripped of management duties. At age 30, the company he'd founded had pushed him out. He would later call this the best thing that ever happened to him. Chapter 2. The Wilderness Years, Next and Pixar. After leaving Apple, Jobs started Next Computer, aiming to build the next generation of powerful computers for education and business. He also bought the computer graphics division from George Lucas for $10 million, naming it Pixar. For the next decade, both ventures would drain his fortune and test his resilience. Next revealed both Jobs' genius and his flaws on full display. He was obsessive about design, spending months on details like the perfect shade of black for the computer case and insisting the internal circuit boards be beautiful, even though users would never see them. The Next Computer was technologically impressive and aesthetically stunning. It was also expensive, late to market, and sold poorly. Jobs made fundamental business mistakes with Next. He insisted on controlling both hardware and software when the industry was moving toward separation. He positioned next for education when universities couldn't afford the high prices. He refused to compromise on design even when it made the product unaffordable. The company eventually abandoned hardware and became a software company, surviving but never thriving. Yet Next wasn't a failure in the long term. The operating system Jobs' team built, Next Step, was ahead of its time, featuring object-oriented programming and a Unix foundation. Years later, this would become the foundation for Mac OS X and iOS. Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web on a Next computer. The wilderness years were developing technology and philosophy that would transform Apple upon Jobs' return. Pixar was an even longer struggle. Jobs bought it as a hardware company, making expensive computers for graphics processing. It wasn't working. The breakthrough came when John Lasseter, a brilliant animator, started making short films to demonstrate the computer's capabilities. These shorts won awards and attention, suggesting maybe Pixar's future was content, not hardware. Jobs initially resisted. He didn't know animation and didn't think of himself as being in the movie business. But as Pixar's hardware sales continued disappointing, he agreed to let Lasseter develop a full-length animated film in partnership with Disney. Jobs invested millions more of his personal fortune. At one point, Pixar was weeks from bankruptcy. He later said that if Pixar had failed, he would have been finished. Toy Story, released in 1995, was a phenomenon. It was the first fully computer-animated feature film and a massive commercial and critical success. Pixar went public 1 week after Toy Story's release, making Jobs a billionaire, ironically, earning more from Pixar than he ever had from Apple. More importantly, it proved Jobs could succeed outside Apple and vindicated his stubbornness about quality. Lasseter and his team had the same perfectionism about animation that Jobs had about products. During these years, Jobs also underwent significant personal growth. He married Lorene Powell in 1991, and they built a stable family life with 3 children. He was still difficult and controlling, but marriage and fatherhood tempered some of his worst tendencies. He also reconnected with his biological sister, novelist Mona Simpson, forming a close relationship. The wilderness years humbled Jobs without breaking him. He learned patience, that great products take time and persistence. He learned that controlling everything has costs. He learned to let talented people like Lasseter do what they do best. And perhaps most importantly, he spent a decade thinking deeply about product design, user experience, and the intersection of technology and liberal arts that would define his later work. By 1996, Apple was struggling. The company had tried multiple strategies. Post-Jobs and all had failed. They needed a new operating system and lacked the capability to build one. In one of history's great ironies, Apple bought Next for $400 million, bringing Jobs back as an advisor. Within a year, he had maneuvered himself back to CEO. The greatest comeback in business history was beginning. Chapter 3. The Return and Renaissance. When Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, the company was 90 days from bankruptcy. It had a confusing product line of dozens of computers, most of them mediocre. It had no operating system strategy. It had lost its identity as the innovation leader. Many predicted Apple wouldn't survive. Jobs set about saving it with characteristic boldness. His first move shocked everyone. He made peace with Microsoft. At Macworld in August 1997, Jobs announced that Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple and commit to developing Office for Mac for 5 years. The crowd booed. Jobs told them, "We have to let go of the notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose." It was pragmatic and necessary. Apple needed Microsoft more than Microsoft needed Apple. Next, Jobs ruthlessly simplified Apple's product line. He drew a simple matrix, consumer and professional across the top, portable and desktop down the side. 4 products, that's it. Everything else was canceled. Deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do, he explained. This focus would become a hallmark of Apple's strategy. The first new product under Jobs was the iMac in 1998, an all-in-one computer in translucent, colorful plastic that looked nothing like the beige boxes dominating the market. It had no floppy drive, which seemed crazy at the time, but it had USB ports for easy peripheral connection and looked gorgeous. Most importantly, it worked beautifully out of the box. The iMac was a hit, bringing Apple back from the brink. Jobs now had breathing room to pursue his bigger vision. He believed the computer could be the hub of a digital lifestyle, managing music, photos, videos, all synchronized across devices. This vision required controlling both hardware and software, which most tech companies had moved away from. Jobs believed integration was Apple's advantage, not a liability. In 2001, Apple launched the iPod with the slogan, 1,000 songs in your pocket. MP3 players existed, but they were clunky with terrible user interfaces. The iPod was simple, elegant, with an intuitive scroll wheel. Jobs obsessed over every detail. It had to fit in a pocket, boot instantly, and be dead simple to use. When engineers said something was impossible, Jobs would push them. "Don't be afraid. You can do this." But the iPod's real genius came 2 years later with the iTunes Store, the first legal way to buy individual songs online for 99 cents. Jobs convinced record labels to participate by arguing that illegal downloading would destroy them, and iTunes was their salvation. The combination of iPod hardware, iTunes software, and the iTunes Store created an integrated ecosystem that competitors couldn't match. This ecosystem approach became Jobs' signature strategy. Competitors could copy hardware or software, but replicating an integrated system where everything worked together seamlessly was nearly impossible. The iPod made Apple cool again and brought millions of Windows users into Apple's orbit for the first time. In 2007, Jobs unveiled the iPhone. He described it as 3 products in one: a phone, an iPod, and an internet communicator. Then he showed a single device that was all 3, a multi-touch screen with no physical keyboard. The audience erupted. The iPhone seemed magical, and in many ways it was. Jobs had pushed his team to create technology that felt like magic to users. The iPhone faced fierce skepticism. Microsoft's CEO, Steve Ballmer, laughed at it. Critics said it was too expensive, that businesses would never accept it without physical keyboards, that the touchscreen was impractical. Within a year, Apple had sold 6 million units and created a new category that would come to dominate the industry. The smartphone wars were over before they'd begun. Apple had won. A year later, Jobs opened the App Store, allowing third-party developers to create apps for the iPhone. This was classic Jobs. Initially, he'd insisted only Apple would make iPhone apps because quality control was too important. Eventually, he was convinced that opening the platform with appropriate controls was the right strategy. The App Store became a platform for massive innovation and a huge revenue source. In 2010, Jobs introduced the iPad, a tablet computer that again faced ridicule. Critics called it just a big iPhone. But Jobs understood that the form factor created new possibilities. Reading, gaming, content consumption, all were better on a larger screen. The iPad created yet another new category and cemented Apple's position as the world's most valuable technology company. Throughout this period, Apple's success wasn't just about products. It was about retail. Jobs insisted on opening Apple stores when everyone said retail was dying. He designed them as places to experience products, with Genius Bars providing support. Apple stores became the most profitable retail spaces per square foot in the world and created direct relationships with customers that competitors envied. By 2011, Apple was the world's most valuable company, and Jobs was recognized as the greatest CEO of his generation. He'd taken a company 90 days from bankruptcy and transformed it into the most successful technology company in history. Along the way, he'd revolutionized music, phones, and tablet computing while creating an ecosystem that locked hundreds of millions of customers into Apple's world. Chapter 4: Product Philosophy and Leadership. Jobs' approach to products was distinctive and counterintuitive. Where most companies conducted focus groups and gave customers what they asked for, Jobs believed customers often didn't know what they wanted until you showed them. "It's not the customer's job to know what they want," he would say. He cited Henry Ford. "If I'd asked customers what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses." The core of Jobs' product philosophy was simplicity. Not just simple appearance, but simple functionality. He would review product designs and remove features, buttons, options. When the original iPod was nearly done, he looked at it and said, "Can we get rid of this button?" Every time. Simplicity was harder than complexity. It required deep understanding to know what was essential and courage to eliminate everything else. Jobs believed in end-to-end integration. Apple controlled hardware, software, and increasingly services. This control let them optimize the entire user experience in ways that competitors who relied on multiple vendors couldn't match. It also meant higher margins and lock-in. Once you bought into Apple's ecosystem, switching became harder. Design was paramount. Jobs famously said, "Design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works. The distinction is crucial." Apple products looked beautiful, but their real design triumph was intuitive functionality. The iPhone succeeded not because it was pretty, though it was, but because using it felt natural. Multi-touch gestures, scrolling, pinching to zoom, these felt obvious in retrospect, but creating that obviousness required intense design work. Jobs insisted on controlling the entire user experience, including packaging. He spent hours reviewing how boxes opened because unboxing was part of the experience. He believed customers started forming opinions before they turned on the device, so every detail mattered. This obsession extended to parts customers never saw. He insisted circuit boards be beautiful, even though most users would never open the case. The reality distortion field was central to Jobs' leadership. He could convince people that impossible deadlines were achievable, that technical obstacles were surmountable, that compromises were unnecessary. Colleagues described this as both inspiring and infuriating. He'd declare something impossible was essential, refuse to accept no. And engineers would work insane hours to deliver what they'd said couldn't be done. Often, they succeeded. But the reality distortion field had a dark side. Jobs would sometimes deny obvious reality, that a product was late, that a strategy wasn't working, that his behavior was hurtful. When engineers said something would take 6 months, Jobs would say it must be done in 3, and they'd figure out how. But this only worked because underneath the distortion field were brutally high standards and usually solid technical instincts. Jobs' management style was binary. You were either brilliant or a bozo. Products were either the best thing ever or complete shit. There was no middle ground. This created intense pressure, but also clarity. You knew where you stood, and people tolerated the abuse because they believed in the mission, and because, ultimately, Jobs was usually right about what would work. He practiced what he called deep collaboration, throwing together designers, engineers, and business people to work problems together rather than in silos. Apple didn't have committees or formal product development processes. They had small teams of A players who Jobs personally selected and pushed relentlessly. He believed in keeping teams small. You should be able to feed the team with 2 pizzas. Jobs was also brutal about canceling projects. He killed products that were good but not great, that didn't fit the strategy, or that couldn't be the best in their category. After returning to Apple, he canceled over 70% of projects underway. He'd rather do a few things extraordinarily well than many things adequately. Perhaps most importantly, Jobs thought differently about profit and purpose. He insisted that profit was a result of making great products, not the goal itself. If you keep your eye on the profit, you're going to skimp on the product. But if you focus on making really great products, then the profits will follow. This philosophy ran counter to Wall Street thinking, but produced extraordinary results. Chapter 5. Personal Life and Relationships. Isaacson's biography doesn't shy from Jobs' personal failures and complicated relationships. Understanding Jobs the man, not just Jobs the visionary, is essential to understanding his complete story, including how his personal demons both fueled and limited his genius. Jobs' most painful personal chapter involved his daughter, Lisa. When his girlfriend, Chrisanne Brennan, became pregnant in 1977, Jobs denied paternity despite clear evidence. He even swore in court documents that he was sterile and couldn't have children. DNA tests proved he was lying. There was only a 0.04% chance he wasn't the father. Still, Jobs maintained the denial for years, forcing Chrisanne onto welfare while he was becoming wealthy. Isaacson explores the psychology behind this cruelty. Jobs had been given up for adoption and struggled with abandonment issues his entire life. Facing fatherhood triggered those issues, and he responded by doing to Lisa what had been done to him, abandonment. Eventually, Jobs acknowledged Lisa, built a relationship with her, and regretted his early behavior. But the damage was done, and their relationship remained complicated. Jobs named a computer Lisa, which he claimed stood for local integrated systems architecture, an obvious lie. Years later, he admitted it was named after his daughter, a strange way to acknowledge paternity while still denying the human relationship. This was classic Jobs, brilliant and cruel, honest and deceptive, in the same breath. His relationship with his adoptive parents was loving but complex. Jobs adored them and credited them with supporting his interests. But he also corrected people who called them his adoptive parents. They were his parents, period. Yet, he spent years searching for his biological parents, driven by questions about identity and belonging that never fully resolved. Jobs's relationships with colleagues followed patterns. He formed intense partnerships with Wozniak, with designer Jony Ive, with others, where he played the visionary and they built his visions. But he also burned through people. Many of Apple's early employees felt betrayed by his stock option decisions. Countless colleagues experienced his cruelty and left, even as others stayed, for decades. His marriage to Laurene Powell was perhaps his most successful relationship. She was smart enough to challenge him, confident enough not to be intimidated, and emotionally intelligent enough to navigate his moods. They built a stable family life with 3 children. Jobs was apparently a better father to his children with Laurene than he had been to Lisa, though he remained difficult and controlling even with them. Jobs's approach to illness revealed his personality in microcosm. When diagnosed with a rare, treatable form of pancreatic cancer in 2003, he initially refused surgery, trying alternative treatments for 9 months. His doctors were horrified. This delay may have cost him his life. Jobs later said this was one of his biggest regrets. It was the reality distortion field turned on himself, the belief that will and unconventional thinking could overcome physical reality. Even as his health deteriorated, Jobs pushed forward. He introduced the iPhone while recovering from cancer. He launched the iPad while on medical leave. He returned from liver transplant to introduce new products. His commitment to Apple and to his vision was absolute, arguably to the detriment of his health and family. Isaacson reveals a man of profound contradictions. Jobs claimed to be Buddhist, but treated people cruelly. He championed counterculture values, but built a corporate empire. He prized simplicity in products, but created complexity in relationships. He could be generous and petty, visionary and myopic, inspiring and abusive, often in the same day. The book also explores Jobs's aesthetics and influences, his Zen practice, his love of music, especially Bob Dylan and the Beatles, his appreciation of great design from Bauhaus to BMW. These influences shaped his taste and his products. The minimalism of Apple products reflects Jobs's Zen aesthetic. The integration of technology and art reflects his belief that they're inseparable. In his final months, Jobs worked with Isaacson on the biography, sometimes for hours, despite being weak. He wanted his story told honestly, flaws and all. He told Isaacson he wanted his children to know him, to understand not just the public figure, but the complete person, including the parts he wasn't proud of. This unusual request for honesty in an authorized biography revealed Jobs's final evolution, from the young man who denied his daughter to the dying father who wanted his children to know his truth. Chapter 6. Legacy and Lessons. Steve Jobs died on October 5, 2011, at age 56. The outpouring of grief was extraordinary. People left flowers and candles at Apple stores worldwide. The company he'd saved had become one of the most valuable in the world. The products he'd created had touched billions of lives. His legacy was secure. But what can we learn from his life beyond think different platitudes? The first lesson is that perfection matters. Jobs' obsessive attention to detail seems excessive until you experience Apple products and realize the details create the experience. The rounded corners on the iPhone, the exact shade of white on the iPod, the specific texture of materials. These details compound into products that feel carefully considered in every aspect. Most companies accept good enough. Jobs never did. But there's a corollary. Perfectionism without taste produces different results than perfectionism with taste. Jobs had extraordinary aesthetic judgment. He knew what beautiful looked like, felt like, worked like. He combined technical understanding with artistic sensibility, which is rare. The lesson isn't just sweat the details, it's develop taste, then sweat the details. The second lesson is about focus. Jobs repeatedly cut products, features, and projects to concentrate resources on what mattered most. When he returned to Apple in 1997, the company was pursuing too many initiatives, none excellently. He focused on 4 products. Later, when Apple was successful and had resources to pursue more, Jobs still maintained focus. The iPod did one thing: play music extraordinarily well. This discipline is hard because focus means saying no to good ideas to preserve resources for great ones. The third lesson concerns integration versus openness. Jobs' insistence on controlling the full stack, hardware, software, services, ran counter to industry trends. Microsoft succeeded by separating software from hardware. Google succeeded with open-source Android. But Jobs believed integration produced better user experiences, and Apple's success validated this. The lesson isn't that integration always wins. It's that there are multiple paths to success, and you should choose the path that aligns with your strengths and vision, rather than blindly following conventional wisdom. The fourth lesson is about teams. Jobs built small teams of extraordinary people and pushed them relentlessly. He refused to hire B players, believing they would hire C players and destroy culture. He paid top talent exceptionally well and removed people who weren't performing. He was brutal in assessments, but also inspiring. People did their best work for him because he believed they could do the impossible. The lesson is that team quality matters more than team size, and great leaders make people believe they're capable of more than they thought possible. The fifth lesson is about the intersection of technology and liberal arts. Jobs studied calligraphy, spent time in India, appreciated music and design. These influences informed his products. He understood that technology alone isn't enough. You need to understand human needs, aesthetics, and how people actually live. This is why Apple products feel different from competitors' offerings. The lesson: broad knowledge and interests outside your field produce better work within your field. But Isaacson's biography also raises difficult questions about the relationship between genius and cruelty. Did Jobs' success require his abusive management style? Could he have achieved the same results while treating people decently? The book doesn't provide easy answers, but colleagues offer mixed views. Some say the cruelty was unnecessary and cost Apple talented people. Others say His relentlessness drove results that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Many readers want to extract lessons from Jobs' success without adopting his cruelty. The challenge is distinguishing which aspects of his approach were essential to success and which were personality flaws that succeeded despite, not because of, their presence. Jobs' obsessive standards, essential. His public humiliation of colleagues, probably counterproductive. His reality distortion field pushing people beyond their perceived limits, valuable. His denial of paternity and parking in handicapped spaces, inexcusable and irrelevant to business success. The ultimate lesson may be that genius is complicated. Jobs created extraordinary value and changed how billions of people interact with technology. He also hurt people, made mistakes, and exhibited flaws that harmed relationships. Both realities coexist. We can admire his achievements while acknowledging his failures. We can learn from his successes while avoiding his cruelty. Jobs' own summary of his legacy focused on products and company culture. He wanted Apple to continue creating insanely great products that enriched people's lives. He wanted to have built a company that would outlast him, driven by values rather than any individual. He succeeded. Apple has continued thriving post-Jobs, releasing successful products that maintain his standards of design and integration. Perhaps the most important legacy is permission to think differently. Jobs proved that markets could be created, not just served. That design and user experience could be differentiators as powerful as technology. That controlling the full experience could win against more open approaches. That taste and judgment mattered in business. These lessons transcend technology and apply to any field where innovation matters. We've explored the complete story of Steve Jobs, from his adoption and unconventional upbringing, through the founding of Apple and his forced departure, the wilderness years at Next and Pixar, his triumphant return and transformation of Apple into the world's most valuable company, his product philosophy and leadership approach, his complicated personal life, and the lessons we can extract from his extraordinary but flawed life. Walter Isaacson's biography is remarkable because it shows us the full person, the genius and the jerk, the visionary and the denier, the creator and the destroyer. Jobs authorized this honesty because he wanted to be understood completely, not sanitized into a corporate hero. This makes the book more valuable as a learning tool than any hagiography would be. The key takeaways: obsess over details because they compound into experience. Focus relentlessly on what matters most and cut everything else. Control the full experience when integration is your competitive advantage. Build small teams of extraordinary people and push them to exceed their perceived limits. Combine technology with liberal arts to create products that don't just work, but delight. Think differently. Create markets rather than just serving them. And understand that perfection takes time, that the first version is never right, that iteration matters. But also remember that genius doesn't require cruelty. Jobs' successes came from his vision, taste, and relentless standards, not from parking in handicapped spaces or denying his daughter. We can learn from his strengths while rejecting his weaknesses. We can demand excellence without humiliating people. We can maintain high standards while treating others with basic decency. Here's your challenge. Identify one area of your work or life where you've accepted good enough when you could achieve excellence with more focus and iteration. Apply Jobs' principle of sweating the details and refusing to compromise on what matters. See what happens when you channel his standards without his cruelty. If this summary gave you new perspective on Steve Jobs, innovation, or leadership, let me know in the comments what insight resonated most. And if you want the complete story with all its complexity, contradictions, and lessons, pick up Walter Isaacson's Steve Jobs. It's not just a biography. It's a masterclass in innovation, leadership, and the complicated nature of genius. Until next time, remember Steve Jobs' famous words: "The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." Think different. Build amazing things, but also be kind. You don't have to choose between excellence and humanity. Thank you for watching